Thank you. Let me start. Can you hear me? Yeah. Let me start off just telling you a little bit about the form of this book. There are 10 stories in this book, and as he mentioned, that an earlier book was somewhat similar to this, called Love's Execution, and another book of stories called Mama and the Meaning of Life. But my relationship to storytelling goes back even further. In my career, I've always enjoyed writing stories, writing narratives, and I started off though at Stanford. You really don't have that kind of luxury if you're working in a medical school. You've got to publish scientific articles and textbooks. So I wrote some textbooks in psychiatry, one on group therapy, another in existential psychotherapy, and in those texts I bootlegged in a lot of very small short stories. A paragraph or two, sometimes a page or two in there. The textbooks have held up over time very well, and I've had many students tell me that they've been willing to read this book and put up with a lot of dry theory because maybe there was an interesting story coming along down the road in a page or two. So I've got dozens of short stories, very short stories in that. But after a while, after about tenure at Stanford, I could start to think of being a little bit freer. And for me, a real jumping off spot was writing a book of Love's Execution, where I did 10 stories. But I wasn't quite satisfied with the stories. I wrote a 60-page afterward explaining what I was trying to teach in the stories, because all the stories are meant to be teaching tales. My secret hidden audience is the very young therapist. And I'm a university professor, and I'm still trying to teach even in my age. So these were teaching tales in a way, but I wanted that long afterward to explain what I was really trying to tell in the story. That was published by Basic Books, and they gave me an editor, Phoebe Haas, who was an editor from hell. And she wanted to tell me, you don't need it afterward. Let the story do the talking, let the story do the teaching. But we battled for about 8 months, and she got my 60-page afterward down to a 10-page forward. So that's part of the background of this. And you're going to notice that I think she's taught me very well, because this book has no forward whatsoever. So I've tried to be much crisper and condense what I'm trying to teach in the story form itself. Let me just say a word about the title. I'm used to the title, but it had a curious ring when I first used it. The title is from a quote in Marcus Aurelius. And one of the stories, Marcus Aurelius comes up. Because I had a patient, I won't read anything from that story, but I had a patient who confessed to me one day, when he was afraid I was going to learn about it anyway from his couples therapist, that I'd been seeing him for some months, and he wanted to tell me that he's never told me that he was living with a woman, we're talking about marriage, but he wanted to tell me, there's another woman who thinks I'm going to marry her too. And he's concealed that from me all this time. Why would you not want to tell me what's going on? He said, I didn't want to disturb my image in your mind. I wanted you to have this certain kind of image. And then I thought of something in Marcus Aurelius, and just impulsively, I thought maybe it was a harebrained scheme. I suggested that he read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And meditation, was in my mind, was a passage from Marcus Aurelius, who says, all of us are creatures of a day, the rememberer and the remembered alike. All is ephemeral, both memory and the object of memory. So that's where the title came from. And let me just say one other thing about that story. What happened is I gave Marcus Aurelius to another patient too. The story's about both of them. And in strange ways, they used it very differently. Both took something out of Marcus Aurelius and used it. And I feel like that's a good metaphor for what we do in therapy. I think in therapy, we have to provide a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of atmosphere, and patients will take out of it different things. Some of them, things that we would never imagine that would be helpful to them. When I finished the book and finished that story especially, I was thinking and tried very hard to get into my first draft a poem by E. Cummings, which I really love, called Molly and Millie and Minnie and May. And the poem is a short poem, but it starts off with Millie and Molly and Minnie and May went down to the sea one day to play. And then each of them finds something different in the sea. Millie finds a stranded star whose raised 5 languid fingers were, and another is chased by a crab, and another is this. And the final stanza of this poem is whatever we seek, oh dear, whatever we seek, like a you or a me, it's always ourselves we find in the sea. So that didn't get into the book. I tried every way, but it just didn't work. I thought what I do today in the reading, and then we'll have some questions and answers, is just to read you the introduction, first introductory paragraphs to 3 or 4 of the stories. The first one I want to read is one that came out in the New York Times last Sunday. Maybe some of you saw it. They ran the first story in there, but they condensed it by 80%. I objected very much to their doing this, but my publisher and my agent, everybody said, be quiet, this is really incredible publicity. But my artist sensibility was offended. I was trying to not do that, but anyway, it's in there. So I'm reading this story to start off almost in self-defense. It's called The Crooked Cure. Email. Dr. Yalom, I'd like a consultation. I read your novel When Nietzsche Wept and wonder if you'd be willing to see a fellow writer with a writing block, Paul Andrews. No doubt Paul Andrews sought to pique my interest with his email, and he succeeded. I'd never turn away a fellow writer. As for the writing block, I feel blessed by not having been visited by one of those creatures, and I was keen to help him tackle it. 10 days later, Paul arrived for his appointment. I was startled by his appearance. For some reason, I had expected a frisky, tormented, middle-aged writer, yet entering my office was a wizened old man, so stooped over that he appeared to be scrutinizing the floor. As he inched slowly through my doorway, I wondered how he could possibly have made it to the top of Russian Hill to my office. Almost able to hear his joints creaking, I took his heavily battered briefcase, held his hand, and guided him to his chair. Thank you, young man. How old are you? 80 years old, I answered. Ah, to be 80 again. And you, I asked, how many years do you have? 84. Yep, that's right, 84. I know that startles you. Most folks guess I'm in my 30s. I took a good look at him. For a moment, our gazes locked. I felt charmed by his elfish eyes and the wisp of a smile playing on his lips. As we sit in silence for a few minutes, looking at one another, I imagine we basked in a glow of elder comradeship, as though we were travelers on a ship who, one cold, foggy night, fell into conversation on the deck and discovered we had grown up in the same neighborhood. We instantly knew one another. Our parents had suffered through the Great Depression. We had witnessed those legendary duels between DiMaggio and Ted Williams, and remembered rationing cards for butter and gasoline and VE Day and Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath and Farrell's Studs Lonigan. No need to speak of any of this. We shared it all, and our bond felt secure. Now it was time to get to work. So, Paul, if we may use first names, he nodded, of course. All I know about you comes from your short email. You wrote that you were a fellow writer. You read my Nietzsche novel, and you have a writing block. Yes, and I'm requesting a single consultation. That's all. I'm on fixed income, and I can't afford more. Okay, I'll do what I can. Let's start immediately and be efficient as possible. Tell me what I should know about the writing block. So that's the first story starting. Arabesque. I was perplexed. After 50 years in practice, I thought I had seen everything. But never before had a new patient entered my office offering me a photograph of herself in the bloom of youth. And I was even more unnerved when this patient, Natasha, a portly Russian woman of 70 or so, stared as intently at me as I stared at the photograph of a beautiful ballerina in arabesque pose, balanced majestically upon one toe and stretching both arms gracefully upwards. I turned my glance back to Natasha, who, though no longer slender, had coasted to her seat with a dancer's grace. She must have sensed I was trying to locate the young dancer in her, for she raised her chin and turned her head just a bit to offer me a clear profile. Natasha's facial features had been coarsened, perhaps by too many Russian winters and too much vodka. Still, she was an attractive woman, though not as beautiful as before, I thought, as I glanced once again at the photograph of the young Natasha, a marvel of elegance. "Was I not lovely?" she coyly asked. When I nodded, she continued, "I was a prima ballerina at La Scala." "Do you always think of yourself in the past tense?" She drew herself back. "What a rude question, Dr. Yalom. Obviously, you've taken the bad manners course that's required for all therapists." But she paused to consider the matter. "Perhaps it's so. Perhaps you're right. But what is strange in the case of Natasha the ballerina is that I was finished as a dancer before I was 30, 40 years ago, and I've been happier, ever so much happier since I stopped dancing." "You stopped dancing 40 years ago, and yet today you enter my office offering me this picture of you as a young dancer. Surely you must feel I would be uninterested in the Natasha of today." She paused, blinked 2 or 3 times, looked about for a minute, inspecting the decor of my office, and said, "I had a dream about you last night." I was sleeping. Third story. So I had met her only once for a single consultation. Our hour together remained sharply etched in my mind. A lovely, saddened, well-spoken woman, Helena came to talk about her friend Billy and cried 3 times in our talk. Billy, who had died 3 months earlier, loomed large in her life. Their worlds had been different. He swirling in the Soho gay world, she ensconced in a 15-year bourgeois marriage. But they had been lifelong friends, meeting in the 2nd grade and living together during their 20s in a Brooklyn commune. She was poor, he rich. She cautious, he devil-may-care. She awkward, he brimming with savoir-faire. He was blonde and beautiful and taught her to ride a motorcycle. Once, she reminisced with sparkle in her eyes, we motorcycled for 6 months throughout South America with nothing but small packs on our back. That trip was the zenith of my life. Billy used to say, "Let's experience everything. Let's leave no regrets. Let's use up all there is and leave death nothing to claim." And then suddenly, 4 months ago, brain cancer, and my poor Billy was dead in a few weeks. But that was not when she cried. That happened a few minutes later. Last week, I reached an important milestone in my life. I passed my state exams and am now a licensed clinical psychologist. Congratulations, that is a milestone. Milestones aren't always good. How so? Last weekend, my husband took our 2 sons and their best friends camping, and I spent much of the weekend assimilating this milestone and reviewing my life. I cleaned house, I sorted through closet after closet packed full of useless possessions and came upon an old, forgotten album of photos of Billy that I hadn't seen for years. I took a deep breath, fixed myself a drink, sat on the floor in a corner, and slowly turned the pages. But this time with starkly different vision, with a therapist's vision. I gazed at my favorite picture of Billy. He was sitting on his motorcycle, leather jacket unzipped, flashing that miraculous midsummer smile, saluting me with a bottle of beer, and beckoning me to join him. I always loved that photo, but suddenly it dawned on me for the very first time that Billy was manic. Billy had bipolar disease. I was staggered by the thought. All those treasured adventures, the crazy wild things we did. Maybe it was all nothing but, and it was here that she cried for the first time. She sobbed for several minutes. I prompted her, "Can you finish that sentence, Helena? It all was nothing but..." Helena continued to weep, shaking her head and apologizing for going through my box of Kleenex. Collecting her thoughts, she ignored my question. It was at that point I phoned you for an appointment. I thought he was bipolar, and the thought that he was bipolar was bad enough. But later in the day, it got even worse as I reread my last emails with Billy. Towards the very end of his life, he wrote me a loving message telling me how much I meant to him, how he treasured my friendship, how he clung to images of me even though chunks of his brain were crumbling away. And then, at this point, Helena broke down and cried for the second time. She sobbed again for tissues as she cried heavily. "Try to keep talking, Helena." And then she continued, as I looked at the email more carefully, she said between sobs, I realized that his letter had been sent to over 100 people, that I was just one of 100, 113 to be exact. I think I'll stop here. I'll read a little bit longer part of this one. It's called "Get Your Own Damn Fatal Illness." Homage to Ellie. While on a month-long writing retreat in Hawaii, I was shocked to receive this email from my patient Ellie. "Hello, Irv. I'm sorry to say goodbye this way, not in person. My symptoms get a lot worse a week or so ago, and so I decided to do a process of VSED, voluntary stopping eating and drinking, in order to die faster with less suffering. I haven't drunk anything for 72 hours now, and should, according to what I've read, start fading soon and die within a couple of weeks at most. I've also stopped my chemotherapy. Goodbye, Irv." I had known from the onset of our work that Ellie would die from her cancer, but even so, I was stunned by this message. I closed my computer, put my work aside, and stared at the ocean in Hawaii. She first entered my life 5 months earlier, also by email. "Dear Dr. Yalom, about a year ago I attended your interview at the Marsh Theater in San Francisco. I felt you'd be a great person to consult. I liked your book, Staring at the Sun. My situation is I'm 63 years old and I have a fatal illness, recurrent ovarian cancer, diagnosed 3 years ago. I'm currently feeling well physically, but I'm in the process of going through all the known chemotherapy drugs that keep the disease in check. And as each drug outwears its usefulness, I can feel the end point drawing closer. I could use some help in figuring out what's the best way to live under these circumstances. I'm not thinking of ongoing therapy, but perhaps 1 or 2 sessions." I didn't experience Ellie's email as unwelcome or unusual, aside from being well-written and fastidiously punctuated. I almost always have 1 or 2 terminally ill patients in my practice, and I've grown confident that I can offer something of value, even in a brief consultation. So I replied immediately, offered her an appointment a week later, gave her my address, informed her of my fee. Her first words as she appeared in the doorway of my San Francisco office, perspiring profusely and fanning herself with a folded newspaper, were, "Water, please." She had raced to catch a bus at the corner near her apartment in the Mission District and climbed 2 steep blocks to my office at the top of Russian Hill. Aging and small of stature, about 5'2", apparently inattentive to her appearance, with tangled hair that cried out for brushing, loose, shapeless clothing, no jewelry, no makeup, she struck me as a faded, wistful flower child, a refugee from the 60s. Her lips were pale and cracked, her face showed weariness, perhaps even despair, but her eyes, her wide brown eyes, gleamed with intensity. After fetching a glass of ice water, I took my seat across from her and said, "I know what a climb you've had to get here. Catch your breath, cool off a bit, and then let's begin." She took no recovery time. "I read some of your books, can hardly believe I'm here in your office. I'm grateful, most grateful for responding so quickly. Tell me what I should know about you and how I might be helpful." She chose to begin with her medical history and began at length in a mechanical tone the course of her ovarian cancer. When I commented that she seemed almost detached from her own words, she nodded her head and said, "Sometimes I go on automatic pilot. So many times have I gone over this story, too many times. But hey, she hastened to add, I'm cooperating. I know you need to know my medical history. I know you must know it. And yet still, I don't want you to define me as a cancer patient. That I shan't do, Ellie, I promise. But please fill me in a bit more. Your email states that you've exhausted the usefulness of several chemotherapy drugs. What does your oncologist tell you? How sick are you?" His words to me at our last visit were, "We're running out of options." I know him well. I've studied him a long time. I know his sanitized, coded way of speaking. I knew he was really saying, "This cancer is eating you alive, Ellie, and I can't stop it." He's tried all the new drugs, and each one had its day in the sun. Each one worked for a while and then weakened, and finally grew ineffective. In my last visit a week ago, I pressed him hard, really hard, for straight info. He fidgeted. He looked so uncomfortable and so sad I felt guilty for pressuring him. He's a really good guy. Finally, he replied, "I'm sorry, but I don't think we have more than a year." Hard message to hear, Ellie. In one way, yes, very hard. But in another way, I almost felt relief at finally getting a straight message from the medical profession. I knew it was coming. He didn't tell me anything I didn't know. After all, I heard him say 2 years ago that it was unlikely I would survive this cancer. Since then, I've had a whole parade of feelings. At first, I was appalled by the word cancer. I felt polluted, terrorized, ruined. It's hard to remember those times, but I'm a writer by trade, and I've jotted down descriptions of my feelings during that period. I'd gladly email them to you if you'd like. I'd like very much to see it. Indeed, I meant it. It only struck me as uncommonly lucid and articulate. Rarely had I heard a patient describe mortal issues so forthrightly. Gradually, she continued. Much of that terror has lifted, though there are times I scare myself by imagining what my cancer looks like. I search the web for hours for pictures of ovaries infested with cancer. I wonder if it's bulging, if it's about to burst open and spew cancer seeds all over my abdomen. Of course, I'm just guessing about all this, but one thing I know for sure is that the idea of limited time has changed the way I plan to live. How so? So many ways. For one thing, I feel different about money, way different. I don't have much money, but I figure I might as well spend what I have. I never had much. I worked most of my job at low-paying jobs as a science writer and editor. Oh, That explains that beautifully written, meticulously punctuated email. Oh yes, God, I abhor what email is doing to language. Ellie's voice grew more charged. No one cares about spelling or punctuation or happy, fulfilled sentences. Be careful, I could talk about this forever. Sorry, I've gotten you off track. You were speaking of your attitude towards money. Yes, I've never made much, never focused on it, never married or had children, and I see no point in leaving money behind. So after my last talk with my oncologist, I made a big decision. I'm going to blow my savings and take a trip with a friend to all the places I wanted to see in Europe. It's going to be a grand tour, a real first-class splurge. Ellie's face sparkled and her voice grew enlivened. I am so looking forward to this. I suppose I'm gambling, making a bet that my doctor is right. He said 1 year. So I've given myself a bit of a margin and put aside enough money to keep me going for 1.5 years. And I'm going to blow all the rest of my trip. It'll be a blast. And if your doctor's wrong, I said, if you live longer than that, if he is wrong, then to put it in technical terms, I'm totally fucked. Ellie flashed a big mischievous grin, and I grinned right back. I got a big kick out of her bet. I've always been a betting man myself, never turning down an offer to bet with my friends, even my children, on baseball or football games, and always relishing my ongoing poker game. Moreover, I felt delighted at the thought of Ellie's grand tour. She described the busyness in her mind. I have some good days, but too often I picture myself in the future, weak, declining, close to death. I often ask myself, will I crave to have people with me at the end? Will I be afraid to be alone? Will I be a burden to others? Sometimes I imagine behaving like a dying animal and crawling off into a cave to hide from the world. I live alone. I don't like it. And sometimes I think of doing what I used to do, renting a large place and getting a whole new set of roommates. But how can I manage that now? Imagine advertising roommates and saying, oh, and by the way, I'll be dying soon of cancer. So those are the bad days. But I say there are good days too. And the good day thoughts. I check into myself often. I ask, how are you doing, Ellie? I tell myself the story of myself. I remind myself of helpful perspectives. For example, that I'm alive now, and that I'm happy to be involved in life, not paralyzed with worries as I was a year ago. But in the background, there's growing darkness. I'm always aware that I have a fatal condition. Always there? Yes, always there. It's a static that never goes away. When I meet a friend who's pregnant, I start calculating whether I'll still be alive when the baby is born. The chemo I take makes me feel awful. I keep asking myself, is it worth it? I play with the thought of decreasing my dose. I'm trying to fine-tune it so that I can live better and live a couple months less, say 9 or 10 months of good life rather than a year of bad life. And then there's something else. Sometimes I think I grieve for the life I haven't had. I guess I have regrets. That statement instantly caught my attention. The exploration of regrets almost always takes the discussion deeper. What kind of regrets, Ellie? I guess regrets for not having been bold enough. Bold? How? She sighed and thought for a minute. I'm too introverted. I've stayed hidden too much, never married, never stood up for myself at work, never asked for more money, never spoke out. I considered pursuing the longing and sadness in her voice, but instead I chose a bolder path. Ellie, this may seem like a strange question to you, but let me ask you, have you been bold enough in this conversation with me today? I was taking a chance. Though Ellie was being honest and sharing difficult things, somehow, for reasons I couldn't quite put my finger on, I felt a certain distance between us. Perhaps it was my fault, but somehow we weren't fully engaged, and I wanted to remedy that. Many individuals with fatal illness feel isolated and think that others hold them at arm's length. And I want to make certain that isn't happening here. Redirecting the flow of the interview into the here and now almost always enlivens therapy by tightening connection between therapist and patient. Ellie was startled by my question, whispering aloud to herself 2 or 3 times, "Have I been bold enough here? Have I been bold enough here?" She closed her eyes, thought for a few seconds, and then suddenly opened them, turned to look directly in my eyes, and declared firmly, "No, certainly not." And I said, "If you were to be bold here, what would you say to me?" I'd say, "Why are you charging me so much? Why do you need so much money?" That's part of my relationship with Yalom. Well, I think maybe we should throw it up for Q&A. Any questions that you have?
My question has to do with stages of life, specifically your stage of life. And I'm wondering how you experience yourself as being different than, or not so different than, the way you think about, engage with patients, approach your writing, do your writing.
That question, for those of you who can't hear it, had to do about stages of life and how I felt about my stage of life and what difference that makes in the way that I feel, the way that I live, the way that I work with patients. And that's a good question. There was a movie about some of my work called The Schopenhauer Cure. Some of you may have seen it at the Mill Valley Film Festival, but I end with this comment that I was very interested in Schopenhauer for a long time, wrote a novel on the Schopenhauer Cure. There's a statement of Schopenhauer's that I'm very interested in. He talked about all of his lustful impulses. He had a major problem with sexual lust, and it governed him a lot of time, and he thought this destroyed a lot of his ability to think. But he says, sometimes I compare these kinds of desires to the sun. And as evening comes along, or as I get older, the sun gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Suddenly I can see all the wonders in the starry skies. They're all visible to me. And so I would say that I'm kind of enjoying the night sky at this point. So I see a lot of things perhaps that I wasn't seeing. So this may sound very strange. I've said this to patients many times. It's almost unbelievable, but really this last decade of my life has been the best decade of all. I feel much calmer. I feel something that I mentioned with Ellie. I do it with practically every patient I see. I look at the question of regrets. That's why her statement really caught my ear immediately. I like to look at that issue, and people talk about the regrets for the way they live, and they can say a lot about that. It makes people very sad and despairing. And then I like to ask the next question, which often has some therapeutic crunch. Well, suppose I were to be meeting with you in a year from now, or 2 years from now. What new regrets would you have built up during this time? And then you ask a question that has a lot of therapy crunch, which is, how do you live a regret-free life, and how would that be possible for you? So those are some of the ways I'd answer your question. I do feel I can count very well. I'm 83, and that is really old. But somehow, when I compare myself with a lot of my peers, I feel I've been spared. I'm still writing. I think I did my best writing in that last book, and I'm working on a maybe appropriate, age-appropriate book now. I'm working on a memoir and enjoying that very much. Other questions, please.
I'm a Jewish psychiatrist born in Cuba, trained in Chicago. Your book of group therapy was my Bible for a while. I'm interested in issues of death, and I am 85, So you are my junior. And,
This is a very rare occurrence for me.
I can imagine. No, but to me it's amazing. Being in some ways from different countries, from different backgrounds, how much similarity I find in your books and my life. And I hope to live, I live a good life, and I hope to die a good death. And I hope that you can help you with that.
Thank you very much. I've done a lot of thinking about that. My thinking about that began a long time ago. When I was a resident in psychiatry, this was back in the late 50s. At that point, the major frames of reference we had were the psychoanalytic frame of reference and also psychobiological. The psychobiological had virtually nothing to offer then because there weren't any effective medications. The first antipsychotic, Thorazine, came out just while I was a resident, so we had very little psychoanalysis. And my own experience as being psychoanalyzed during my residency, I felt that had raised a lot of questions. I felt that it was not the most effective way we can think about patients. And just then, when I was a first-year resident, Roald May's book called Existence came out. And I loved that book. I read it. It had some wonderful essays by Roald May. It had a lot of translations from European, more existentially oriented philosophers about our field. So I started reading then, and then I began aware of the fact that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in philosophy. People have been thinking about existential issues since the beginning of written history. And so then I felt that I thought there was a third way then, in addition to psychoanalysis and to the medical approach, that maybe there was an existential approach. And that's when I began what's become almost a major theme of my life. I started taking undergraduate courses in philosophy at Hopkins where I was a resident, and I've been sort of educating myself about philosophy ever since then. And then when I came to write a book on existential psychotherapy, when I finished the work I was doing on group therapy, and I knew that the most of what I was going to have to say has to revolve around death. Every one of us, if we only think for a while and remove ourselves from our distractions and think about our being in the world, all of us will come at some point to the fact that we're mortal and we have to die. So I wanted to write about that. But I couldn't find any patients to talk about it with. I didn't know how to talk to my average everyday patient about it. I didn't know how to do it. That I do now. But and then I started to say, well, I'll start to work with patients who have to talk about it because they've got a fatal illness. So I spent about 10 years working with cancer patients, started leading groups of cancer patients, and they taught me a great deal about how to live. One scene that was really so etched in my mind was a patient, an older patient with very terminal metastatic cancer, saying what a pity it was that I had to wait till now, till my body was riddled with cancer, to learn how to live. Because the confrontation with death that person had been having was teaching them very different stories about how to live. And so my quest became then, well, how do we use that leverage with people who don't have any disease, who may be younger? How do we help them live their lives differently and enrich their lives by thinking about that? I put as much as I know about that particular topic in a book called Staring at the Sun, the subtitle which is Overcoming the Terror of Death. But thanks for your question. Or statement. Other thoughts?
Wow.
So if this were a therapy session? What's the silence? What's the silence?
I don't have a question, I have a comment. You were here 2 years ago, and you were all about the value of story. And
I was what? I didn't hear you.
you you are all about the value of story.
Yes.
And 2 years ago, when I was here in your audience, I had the opportunity to tell you a story. You paid rapt attention, and you thanked me for the story. So now that experience is a story that I tell other people about the day I met Dr. Yalom.
Right. 2 years ago, it's only that, right? Really, I forget. That was when I was talking about a novel called The Spinosum Problem, I remember.
Yes.
The Spinosum Problem has had an interesting course of therapy. It wasn't an immediate big seller in this country. It's a demanding book, philosophically oriented. I'd always wanted to write a novel about Spinoza, but it had much bigger course and bigger sales in Europe by far, 10 times as much perhaps in Europe than in the United States. So I was somehow kind of a little unhappy that the book even hadn't been reviewed very much in this country. And then I thought about Woody Allen's movie. I've forgotten the name of the movie, but it was a movie in which he was a film director, had his last big chance to direct a movie, and suddenly in the midst of making the movie, he had an attack of hysterical blindness. He couldn't see. Do you remember the movie? Do you know the name of it? No, but anyway, so he hires someone who becomes his eyes, whispers into his ear. Doesn't want anyone to know he's blind. They won't let him make the movie. And the movie was a total disaster. It was awful. And he was getting terrible reviews in this country, was about ready to slit his wrists and stuff. When suddenly, it's a one-joke movie. Somebody comes in right at the end of the movie with big headlines saying they love the movie in France. Anyway, that same thing happened with the Spinoza. They love Spinoza in France, and one big award there is best novel of the year. So I really empathize with Woody Allen. All right, well, we're off course from this book. Back to it. Other thoughts or questions about writing this book, or about what you want to ask them? Please.
I want to ask you how you feel being Jewish has helped you as a storyteller, as a therapist, or if you feel it has not.
I don't really know the answer to that question. I've never been when I was young, I was very unhappy about being Jewish and rebelled a lot, refused to learn Hebrew. And I've just been writing in my memoir. I've had a lot of fun writing this chapter. I think it was a great disgrace to my parents for refusing to learn Hebrew at the bar mitzvah. My uncle had to come up and read the passage. So I'm having an interview in the book that I've just written about me as a 13-year-old boy seeing a psychiatrist who was me, the older psychiatrist, and I'm interviewing myself. And the older psychiatrist, I'm saying, oh, I couldn't learn Hebrew. I thought I'm very bad with languages. I always made bad languages in Hebrew. And I'm saying, oh, have mercy. Who's going to believe that? And so we're having some banter back and forth. But go back to your question. I don't know how to answer that. There were a lot of very good Jewish storytellers, but I love Dickens and a lot of the English storytellers. And right now I'm having a wonderful time reading Trollope. And so, do you have any other thoughts about that? I'm glad to discuss it.
Well, it's an interest of mine to know how, I guess the thought or the discursive kind of reasoning, being a Jew, has helped me also understand human complexities, and if it has it in fact actually helped?
Well, there's a strong tradition, of course, in Jewish storytelling. The Talmud is full of stories, but I'm sorry, I have to confess, I never read it. However, having said that, there's a strange affinity for the books I've written in Near Eastern countries, which I've never quite understood. My biggest market per capita is by far Greece. I don't know why, but Greece, Turkey, Israel. So there's something maybe kind of Mideastern, maybe Semitic that comes through in the pages of that. Please.
Well, it seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, but that your original stories years ago were the first stories that expressed how therapists truly feel about their patients. And then hearing these excerpts, it seems like there's a lot more compassion. Did something change for you?
A lot more compassion. I have a feeling that you may just be referring to one story, which I feel pretty sorry I wrote sometimes. Everybody's heard that story, and I've been getting a lot of grief about it over the years, which is called The Fat Lady. And did not have compassion in some people's eyes for her. And I acknowledge I went over the top with that story because I do have a lot of problems with morbidly obese people. But that story has never been correctly read, I think. I was writing that story because I was ashamed of the way I felt about her, and I was dealing with countertransferences, feelings which I felt I worked through by the end of the story. So a lot of people, I was interviewed by Terry Gross on Fresh Air, and she just would not let me go. I maybe insulted her, but I told her, Terry, I do not think you read the end of that story, because the end of the story is tries to point out that I'm the patient here. I knew that. But I feel the rest of those stories, I felt I was, in the same way that I am now in terms of compassion. But yeah, that story I've heard about many times. I have an equally number of communications of emails from therapists who feel that story taught them a lot about dealing with countertransference.
It's very freeing.
Yeah. Okay.
Time for maybe one more?
Sure.
I wanted to ask if you noticed throughout your therapy sessions if there are any differences when you do therapy with people from different cultures. If you notice if cultural values influence in any way the way they present their problems. I mean, I'm not sure how much it's true. For sure it's valid for your books in terms of being successful, but...
Well, I have had a good bit of contact. Lately I've been doing, the last few years, I've been doing some Skype therapy with people from all over the world who call me in, and I really found that whole idea rather repellent because I'm so focused on the intimacy of the two people in the room. And I resisted it and didn't like the idea of phone therapy or anything like that. But then a woman called me who lived in a very remote part of the world. She was 500 miles from the nearest therapist or doctor there. So I thought I would give this a try, and I was quite positively surprised by this. We did very good work together. In fact, I had a strong suspicion that I could not have worked with her face to face. She went to this remote place to get away from everybody. So since then, I've been doing Skype therapy and worked with people from many different cultures. And the only time that I've really had some issues with what you're saying is working with a couple of people from India and trying to. Lots of the problems that were going on were very much of a cultural problem, and I had to learn much more about the culture, especially the women's position in the culture, to understand that. So I felt my understanding went quite slowly with them until I really began to be educated by them about what their culture was like, and that accounted for a good bit of what was going on in these patients, and especially in their marriages.
Thank you, Dr. Yalom, for being here today.